Greetings all, Raphael, Dr. Raphael X here with my friend Jeremy to talk on a very interesting topic, the proofs of the soul. We want to revisit this topic because a lot of people have been questioning. In our other videos, we really maybe haven't pinpointed the proofs properly speaking, or we haven't elaborated on them, but we want to do so here and deal with other issues after that. So the proofs of the soul basically, we are our foundation will be the classical philosophers, of course, which classical because they are still relevant today. Right? That's by definitions what classical means. So soul. So we don't have direct experience, so we're material, right? We're using these basic categories: matter, immaterial, not matter. Um, we're not getting into scientific notions of matter, which is actually still in question. I know scientists who deny the reality of matter, philosophers who are immaterialists, but just look at the word immaterialist. We know that indirectly, not directly, like immortal. These are things that we don't know, infinite. We don't know directly but indirectly. So we can know that the soul exists first proof through its effects, right? Through our operations, because the operations, the being, the operations proceed from the being. So the operations reveal what the being is. And look at the operations we have. We have intellection, we have free will, right? Which has no, and now science is trying to incorporate that with whole quantum physics, but it would have to point to an immaterial element that's not subject to the physical laws like matter is. So we have these immaterial operations that we have, the things that we know that are eternal, like definitions of things. Circles change, but the definition of circle or circular things change, but the definition of circular doesn't change. Equal things change. There's no two things that are perfectly equal, but the notion of equal does not change, and they exist perfectly. They're eternal, and we know that they're in us. So this is an operation that reveals the being, eternal, soul, right? Immortal being, immaterial, unchanging, immortal being. And that's another aspect of this conversation, that the soul is immortal, right? Because the soul is pure simplicity, not composed of parts. And this brings to another, and then if you want to chime in here, Jeremy, in a second, another um, proof of the soul, we can say the fact that we are persons, we are subjects of change, but the subject, as subjects, we do not change. So, for example, I am myself at 5 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old, but materially speaking, bodily speaking, there has been, a whole bunch of changes. This is what physics studies, the most basic reality of change that we experience. We know this exists immediately. So, but there has to be something that doesn't change deep down, some ultimate substratum. This is the person. The person is throughout, right? So this is the proof of the soul. What makes you you throughout, all these different types of changes through decades? What makes you subsist as you? It has to be something immaterial, the soul. That's the second proof. And the third proof, I would say, and shortly, briefly rather, that really, there, if we're going to talk about cause and effect, and this is the basis of science, all effects have causes. There can't be an infinite number of material causes in me. Like, what causes my hand to move? You say the bones. What causes that? The nerves, blood cells, all the way down. You can't have an infinite regress of material causes. Now, I don't mean chronologically. I mean in priority. There has to be a first cause that is uncaused in a sense. In us, there has to be this first cause, like the first person who pushes the domino, in the domino effect. All the dominoes are falling thanks to the first one. So this first cause cannot be material itself, or else you would ask, well, what causes that? And that's a legit question. So the soul, and this is where the definition comes, the principle and cause of life. The soul is the first cause, and this first cause has to be immaterial by definition, because again, you cannot have in priority immaterial regress of infinite causes. It's by definition, because matter is limited by definition. So you cannot have this, something limited infinite. It just doesn't make any sense. So if we're referring to a first cause, then this first cause would have to be immaterial ultimately as a third proof. But if you want to chime in here, Jeremy, I know we were talking a lot about this. We didn't really expand or again make it as clear as we want to do in this video until we get to the next topic. But yeah, go ahead if you want to chime in here. I know you have a lot to say on this topic.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we could kind of pick up from last time, right? If we're sunk in the movement of thought associated with the name of Descartes, for example, which would have body be one thing and mind be another thing, then the question of whether or not uh, uh, there is any element, constituent element of the individual that is other than body becomes a really tricky question. And indeed, if we start with the assumption that um, uh, the world as described by equations, right, by modern physics is reality, then we cannot really find room for uh, some kind of what would then be mystical or magical element that would somehow intercede and come in, right? And I feel that's how people typically think of that which would be associated with the term that you used. Here I am. I know for sure that I have a brain or that I am a brain and I am my body. And whether or not there's some sort of mist or some sort of vapor, I something like that that is somehow tied in with my anatomy. That's a question. Maybe it leaves me after I die. Right? Maybe it has a weight, something like this. So we can kind of turn things around a little bit and say that any and all phenomena must be thought of on the same footing of knowledge. I, in in physics, there's a distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Purportedly, primary qualities are that which are those qualities which inhere in reality out there, right? For example, size, shape, number, and secondary qualities are mental. For example, color, taste, smell, and so forth. So this was a split made centuries ago, and it's a split that forms the foundation, the philosophical foundation of contemporary, for example, physics and naturalism, to so call it, right? Meaning certain qualities are mental and certain qualities are physical. But as has been said no few amount of times, there's not really any grounds for such a split. I uh, I look at a red square. The red is mental, but the squareness is physical, and somehow they collide together. It's such a hodgepodge, and it's so um, vague and confusing. Instead, we say any and all qualities that exist, anything that exists can be thought of in the same way, right? Whether it's a feeling, whether it's a color, whether it's size, whether it's shape, whether it's number, whatever the case might be. Now, if such is so, then it follows that I can ask myself to whom does that content appear? Can it be thought of as existing on its own? Right? Can a color exist to its own self? Can a shape or size or emotion exist to its own self? Seemingly not. Right? It exists to a subject. Uh, and who is that subject? Well, it's me in my essentiality. I am that subject. Right? I'm a universal. I'm a principle capable of sentience and thought and such. Right? And to me, content such as can be considered in different ways appears. Just like in a dream, I fall asleep and I dream things from the first person, excuse me, point of view of some other person, right? Everything in the dream comes to me as a subject, both my body in the dream and the sky in the dream and the earth in all of that. By no means are we suggesting that life is a dream, then the word dream would have no meaning, but it's just to highlight the epistemology of the matter. All of it exists in the same way to the subject. Now, if that is so, then there certainly does seem to be room to posit the reality of the subject, right, which can never, on principle, be threatened by the phenomenal world. And further, then the question of individuality. Right? in principles of individuality becomes an empirical question. It is a fact that each person starts off as a baby and then may or may not develop further and develop psychologically, mentally, emotionally, and such. That's simply a fact. And that then could mean what, use the word soul. We can mean that by soul if we want. And it simply becomes a fact of observation. There need not be any positing, nor is there room to posit any, again, vapors or mist or anything that's invisible or anything like that. It is a matter of observation. The fact is, there are individualities and they develop in connection with our efforts and our experiences and our thought and so forth.
An interesting point, which you alluded to before, is the individuality. Now, this is a profound metaphysical question, that's been dealt with at least in classical metaphysics, Platonic, well, more Aristotelian medieval metaphysics is the question of individuality. And this is interesting because what is the principle of individuality? What makes the individual individualized? What is the ultimate explanation or the sufficient reason of an individual being such? And the problem we have with the universals, with the immaterial, with the forms that is called Platonic, even Aristotelian forms, is that the forms are universals. So when we're talking about the soul, interpretation like from the Muslim philosophers, Averroes, I believe Avicenna had this also, is that there's a universal soul. Their philosophies actually were totally incompatible with even Islam. And I believe they were given the ultimatum to accept philosophy, Aristotle, or Islam, and I think they selected the fourth Aristotle. So there's the problem here: is immaterial universal, and then um, what are individuals are just material things. This is the common sentence, or the common opinion of Plato and Aristotle. Just obviously the form and the matter. So the form, what things are, exists in another world, the world of the forms. Right? We get this from his allegory, the cave. His metaphysics, and here on earth are individual bad copies, but the individuality is like a lesser reality. Real reality is just is universal, and that's where we can have knowledge. That's where epistemology comes in, and we only have knowledge of the forms. If I say something about an individual concrete thing, that's just a matter of opinion. For Plato, so he radically differentiates here. But with Aristotle, this is interesting, and you see a lot of medieval philosophers take this in Christendom, that it's the matter that individualizes the form, the universal. So you are now it's this is the problem with the soul though, because the soul is individual. So how do you get to an individual soul, right? This has been an issue plaguing society. But let's say let's not point to a human. Let's say a cat. So a cat has a universal of catness. It has a what and it has a this. Right? So the what of catness is its form, is universal, and it's a this because it's material. Right? It's individualized. It's an individualized universal. Because you said we're individuals, but you also said we're universals, which seems like a contradiction, but it's not, because of this, right? This philosophical explanations in metaphysics. So you are a universal, but you're individualized by matter. So you're a cat, right? Well, not you particularly, but this cat is a cat, and its form and its matter, its thisness comes from its material element, which individualizes it. Now, this is a big problem, especially in, for religion, Catholicism too, is a big problem because then how do we, when we die, how are you, right? So I just like to point to a philosopher who's one of my favorites, Suarez, Francisco Suarez, who says, no, the individuality stems from the entire entity of the being. It doesn't come from the matter. So we do have individualized forms, which is very interesting. So like Peter, he has an individual soul, his individual form, because the form of a person, of a human person, is the soul. Is the soul of anything that has a soul. Um, Later, we could talk about animal soul and vegetative souls, which are not immortal, but they are still the principles of life. So these souls are the ones that animate, are the forms and give it the whatness. So you are principally your soul, right? And we can even point to another proof really of the soul existing, that when I if I see a corpse, I know that person's not there. I know essentially they're missing. It's not purely reduced to biological functions. We know this immediately. A child knows this self-evidently, that the person is no longer there. Something is gone, right? Again, not mere biological function. So the individuality has to be more than just material things. There has to be individuality within the immaterial realm. And then we get to the level of the angels. In Catholicism, we believe, and in other religions, they believe angels exist. And how are they individualized, though? And Thomas Aquinas has his explanation that each one is a species unto itself. But really, it would have to, the explanation would have to be that the entity itself, it provides the individuality, and it's more than that. Being itself, by definition, being is individual. It's within the definition of being. Being is not a mere abstract universal, right? It's not merely that. There is a notion and concept of being, yes, but the concept of being is in its definition, as it exists actually, is individualized in its very self, from its very entity. That makes sense. I don't know if you wanted to expand a little bit or comment or kind of take it another way.
There's some really fascinating points, Professor. The question of the reality of individuality and its status, as some philosophers would put it, in the intelligible world, has been thought about for a long time. And we have to, first of all, appreciate the mystery, right? Of all the ages that we understand have been and will be, of all the times and places and the people that have been, how in the world am I me right here and right now? Right? If there's going to be an eternity within which I will not be, and there was one before, or at least a very long time, excuse me, how can I be right now and right here? And how can I be myself and not you or the cat or somebody else? So that's a tremendous mystery. I'm not aware of any perfectly clear answer to it. I certainly don't have one personally. A few comments could be perhaps offered. One would be that, as you mentioned, personhood can be defined as a cognizance of oneself as a universal. As a possibly self-conscious Homo sapien, I can think of myself as a universal, meaning an unindividual possibility or instance of sentience, intelligence, freedom, and such. I can be conscious of a self, it seems, such that is not entirely private to me. For example, it would seem, or it can be argued, that I can be conscious of consciousness, quote unquote. I can cognize intelligence itself. I can cognize
Right.
cognition itself,
Yeah.
such as is not private to any given individual. Phenomena such as cannot be said to have been born on a certain date or that shall die, or that can conceivably vanish. Now, it would seem that such self-consciousness is the foundation of, for instance, proper human relations. Because I can cognize myself as a self, I can see that same universal in others, or as indicated by other eligible forms, meaning not corpses, brought up, right? Not objects, but other selves, such as am I. And consequently, in interacting with another person, in some sense, I'm interacting with myself, truly. But in a different sense, I'm not interacting with myself to the extent to which individuality is a reality. Right? Certainly, here is one body and there's another body. Here is one mind and there's another mind. Here's one psychology and there's another psychology. Right? So honoring that difference is obviously essential, and recognizing that different individualities um, indicate different differences in being to some extent. If I simply read myself into any and all, I'm just delusional. For example, I see a baby and I begin to talk to the baby as I talk to a professor like you, right? Or I begin to, I see a person that is mentally challenged and I don't acknowledge that at all. Right? Part and parcel of um, kind of being a proper human would be to really try to analyze who it is that we're dealing with, the minds that we're dealing with, and try to paint a picture of the individuality in question. And yet, that individuality, it would seem, is, so to speak, painted onto the universal, that one is oneself. And again, I think that gives the foundation of ethics, right? If I'm dealing with something that is truly not self, such as a stone, or some other object, then there's absolutely no reason for me to. In fact, I have no justification to treat the object with anything like love or respect or anything like that, except as it benefits me. Love and respect is reserved for persons, and persons are, it would seem, individuated instances of, as to use the term we're using, of a universal. Again, now how that really works in reality, how am I me and you're you, and the cat is the cat, and how are we here now is again a tremendous mystery. But something along those lines, it seems it is possible, even at our kind of in our infinite ignorance, to somewhat make out.
Yeah, for sure. And ethics is underpinned by metaphysical and epistemological theories without a doubt. And also, ethics is, well, political philosophy is the beginning of ethics. So let's kind of get into the effects of, and this is important talking about the consequences of certain views. Ideas have consequences, and this is very important. That's why philosophy is so important. It's not just living in the abstract world. It illuminates and influences the concrete world without a doubt. We live in the world of ideas. We all live according to a theoretical, scheme of things. We're all little philosophers in a sense. So, so what are the consequences of denying this the existence of an immaterial realm in man? The denial of affirming that the soul exists in man, and its tremendous consequences. And maybe we could talk a little bit about, thinking of two, in the political realm, right? How is it? Because ultimately, right, right, also ultimately disembarks in politics, right? So culture and then politics is the last one, basically. So really, what's going on here, and it's almost like an anti-human type of political realm where you have, with more classical political theories, like liberalism, conservatism, even socialism. You have pro-human political theories, but with environmentalism, at least in this strong aspect, you have a very staunch anti-humanism, right? Where to the very minimum, within strong environmentalism, you seek the equation of non-human entities, equation in dignity, and human entities, kind of they're equal. And why is this? Because really, the affirmation of the soul is essentially what separates us from other creatures, from other natural things, right? Because of the effects of the soul, the immortality of the soul, and this gives man certain transcendence. This is the basis of his dignity, the basis of his primacy, right? Man is the greatest, the culmination of creation. Well, we won't use creation for those who don't believe in it. That's another topic for later, but we can say the culmination of nature, of natural things, is man, right? And it has to be affirmed explicitly in this immaterial element and immaterial and immortal, which I would say go hand in hand, element in man. Because if not, there is no, the whole grounding problem. We can't affirm anything with the grounding. For there is no ground, right? So with these environmentalists, and you're seeing this, this radical promotion of like going back to the indigenous way of life, or even going back to the Stone Age, right? This is explicitly wanted, uh, where we go back to uh, these times where people worshipped nature, right? And this has always been seen within the Judeo-Christian mindset as a distortion of man, right? As the antithesis of Christianity. Thank God for Christianity. It was really able to affirm the dignity of man and uh, and show nature its place. And nature is good, but nature is given to man. Now, of course, we have to conserve. We have to respect it. We can't just use up resources, waste in a wasting manner. But there's this separation between man and nature, where nature is not divinized. Nature, there is no, there's no animism. The soul is not in things, but it is in man, right? Who sees things, who only man is created in the image and likeness of God. And I forget who it was, but there's an atheist philosopher who said, even if this weren't true, this is a beautiful doctrine and really would be will solve the problem of the grounding issue, right? To help really societies flourish, to affirm the basis of rights for man, individual rights, right? Even communal rights. That very ancient um, battle, we can say, in politics between collectivism and individualism. That will mean nothing without affirming what is even the basis of rights, right? So now we're seeing this turning towards environmentalism, which is having its religious strain. Right? It has a certain religious bent, I should say, akin to the Eastern religions, right? And what's really interesting to this is that the fact that man is a moral creature, and I think this is self-evident, right? And even the in the civil court system, we punish man for his um, evil actions. And sometimes that punishment can be used to educate man or as a deterrence, like to put a man in jail. We don't put tigers in jail. So we know that man's a moral creature. But what environmentalism does, and AI does also, it 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 sees man because he's moral, not in the positive aspect, but in the negative aspect, meaning that man is capable of evil, therefore man is evil. And there's truth to that. The premise is true that we are capable of evil, but we're also capable of good, right? So man is not the Satan of the earth, precisely because he has this soul, precisely because of who he is, right? We can't just judge in the past, the tremendous current events that tend to focus on, negative events like the world wars and all this, which environmentalism does. It preaches a kind of flimsy, superficial love. But we also have to focus on the goodness of man in himself. Right? That's very important because we cannot have ethical or political goodness without affirming this metaphysical good in man, which can only be the immutable, right, and immaterial aspect to this element in him, which is the soul. But you want to go on and take it which way. If you want to talk about the AI or environmentalism, or feel free to.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that were brought up. Maybe we could try to tie it together by talking a little bit about what we do know, it seems, as it concerns individuality and its healthy development, and also in connection with um, some of the things you mentioned, such as uh, radicalization in the arena of politics and group involvement and such. So we say that whatever be the ultimate answers to these inscrutable riddles of individuality, we can kind of start with where we're at and observe that in order to progress as a would-be self, as a would-be individual, in the higher connotations of the terms, I have to overstep my self-centeredness and my egoism and my self-idolatry. Normally, the baby already has self-will. My way or the highway. Nah, right, I'm cold, I'm hot. You know that, I'm sure. Right? The baby has self will from the beginning. Now, that self will excuse me, converts typically into egoism. Me, such and such individual that is better than some, worse than others, such and such. Now that, excuse me, bro. Now that egoism then typically is the center of my world. I am self-centered, right? And consequently, it tends to convert into self-idolatry. There's no higher reality than me, myself, and I, and my egoism. And that's how I live life. And I serve self. I worship at the dark altar of self. Now, that self, it can get very pricey to continue to sustain my self idolatry, right? Because if I'm my own idol, if I'm supposed to be perfection, well, I'm supposed to be the best. I'm supposed to be the most intelligent. I'm supposed to be the most beautiful, the most successful, just the best. When I see that I'm not, right, perhaps I have a bad deck of cards as it concerns my looks, my intelligence, my success in life, right? It gets very dark and scary for me. And I have the impulse to throw out my egoism, my self idolatry into something else that is a little bit bigger than myself, but that ultimately permits me to continue to worship myself in a somewhat devious and unclear form. And that's where, for example, radical movements in politics and all these kinds of groups would come in. Right? So, for example, I can no longer worship myself as this nice face because maybe it's not so nice, as the successful person because maybe I'm not so successful, as this wealthy person because maybe I'm not so wealthy. But I still want to worship myself because I'm still unregenerate ethically, right? So I go and I find a target that relates right back to me, such as the politics or the other group or the this or the that, and then I begin to worship it. Right? And now perhaps I don't have egoism. Perhaps my ego is gone, but I'm in an even worse spot than I was before because my goal is to really truly find myself. My goal is to really truly attain to self consciousness and be reality centered with a capital R, not self centered. So if I transmute my self centeredness into any one of these, again, devious little forms, I've become, whatever the ism is, this kind of ism, that kind of ism, this and that. I played myself. And we see that when a person has been so radicalized, good luck doing anything with them, right? Somebody has joined the cult that promises them supreme success and happiness. Right? Good luck. Right? Somebody has joined the radical movement. Good luck speaking and reasoning with this person. So what then I need is that ethical regeneration. I need to go from being self-idolatrous to opening myself up to the sense of reality over and above me. And how to do that, that would be a whole separate question. But that would be the idea. But my real individuality, it would seem, lies past that self-idolatry. Real individuality is not egoism. It's not self-conceptions. This kind of person and that kind of person. It would seem to be real individuality, like as a matter of fact, something that is individual and yet is universal at the same time. But in order to attain to that, I have to be willing to give up myself, to find myself. I have to be willing to die, to live. Right? I have to be willing to sacrifice the self that normally I worship in order to find a more real, substantive, possibly more lasting self.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It definitely, this whole environmentalism, AI, and and really nature worship is really it's not incompatible, but it's the contrary. It's directly related to self worship, because it's really when the supernatural is denied, like that which transcends us. And again, this comes from Revelation Christianity. This is, again, we're talking philosophy, but we're talking about how the positive effects of Christianity, what they have been. And this is huge. The fact that the supernatural has put the natural in its place, because man has this innate desire for what transcends him. That's why if we're not religious, we'll be superstitious. That's just the way it is. um, that we will supernaturalize the natural on our own. So, thank God for revelation and for the existence of the soul. That the soul is something that transcends. It's the basis of our supernatural life, right? Not that we're supernatural in a sense just merely because we have a soul, but it is a kind of image of the supernatural in us. Excuse me, the fact that we have this immaterial aspect, the fact that we are God-like, if we understand God as being, the ultimate immaterial thing that is infinite, we have this image to God, image of God in us, right? And this is um, and it's pure reference. So it's not like we are enclosed into ourselves. The individual, yes, is incommunicable. It cannot pass its individuality to another. But at the same time, we are pure reference because of, what essentially we're made up of. Um, so it's really, you can harmonize these two apparently contradictory terms, but they're not. That man is everything and man is nothing at the same time. It's hard to get, I guess, into harmony with that. Yes, we have a body. We're like nature in all things, right? We decompose. We're made up of parts. But individually speaking, we also have this soul that gives us a certain transcendence as the basis of our rights, right? It's the basis of our, right? And even of the political systems that should be pro-human. It's funny that we have to say that. Um, so, and if not, then we will supernaturalize the natural and we'll return to a pagan worship that wants to go back to man living like animals, right? It seeks to go back as man, essentially, living without any type of institution, social institution that will hinder him. It's almost like we're going back to the notion of Rousseau of the good nature, this extreme, crazy optimism in man's nature alone that he is self-sufficient. He doesn't need really anyone else. Um, he just needs to follow his desires, and his desires ultimately will lead him to fulfillment. Which and this extreme optimism definitely brings us to an extreme pessimism, also a Hobbesian view of man. They're not too dissimilar. They're just dissimilar in terms, but really not in content. Extreme optimism, extreme pessimism, where Hobbes saw that the nature of man was totally corrupted, right? And Rousseau, the nature of man, so good, totally good and not it shouldn't be hindered ultimately. So yeah, we do need a check from outside, right? We do need a certain revelation for man to reveal who we are, because even though philosophy can reveal this, our reason is it's hard to figure out these truths because they're so abstract. We live in a concrete world, and we are obfuscated, as we would say as Catholics, by sin, and the disordered passions. So Christianity is definitely the way, and it elucidates man and shows the dignity of the individual again. But I'll give you the last word if you want to say a lot of little points there. Yeah, have a couple minutes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, great points. Um, that idea of the noble savage of,
Mhm.
say, Rousseau is preposterous, I would say. It's
Very common
we
today.
don't need to speculate much. We can go visit an uncontacted tribe today. We shouldn't do that. That would be probably a very stupid thing to do, as some people have found out. But we could. And the fact is that in such lower stages of civilization, individuality cannot and will not rise above a very low level. All right. So we say, for example, interestingly enough, let's say that I'm a farmer and I have 10 cows, 20 cows. I can learn to distinguish them for sure, physically and also temperamentally. This cow is the one that is a little bit more aggressive, less aggressive. But imagine trying to describe a specific cow that lived 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. What are you going to say? All right. Oh, the cow was really extra, nice. What can you say? Because the individuality of animals cannot rise much above the corporal level. They're corporally distinguished. Here's one cow. Here's another cow. But personality cannot flourish in a cow hardly at all. Right? And as we reach the higher primates, for example, we see more instances of individuality. Somebody that has spent a lot of time with chimps, like Jane Goodall or someone, certainly can name them and can say, okay, this is the chimp that has this personality. But we see it's also a strict cap, right? And what makes us, one of the things that makes the Homo sapien special is that there doesn't seem to be a cap on that individuation, on that individuality and personality that can be developed. But the only way to develop it is in tandem or amongst others in civilization, with the fruit of civilization available to us. I might have had the potential to be anybody, but if, goodness forbid, I'm locked into a small room since childhood and I have no access to education and to other people, I'm not going to become much of anything at all. I'm going to remain at that level of an animal. So we see also that should hopefully, taking these extremes, that should highlight these dynamics. If the civilizational tenor remains low, the individuality remains low. Each and every generation produced in that civilization, nobody will rise much above the status quo. There needs to be that civilization. There need to be other people. There need to be, for example, the works and the deeds and the experiences of the good and the great. Right? I need to be taught. I need to be educated. I need to have friends and family members and be involved in different things. And that's how I develop myself to a point of distinct, genuine individuality above the animal level, above the fact that simply I have one stomach and you have another stomach. Right? So, and that requires then, that calls for society. Right? And consequently, ideally, the society that is had is in reference to these goals that are distinctly human, right? That separate us from the brutes and the beasts and the birds and the bugs. Um, and if a society is so structured, then it can produce generation after generation great individuals. But unfortunately, these golden times are far and few between, far as it seems. Historians can highlight some special kind of points in history, some certain times, but usually because we remain self-centered, because we refuse to give up the claims of our selfishness and our self-idolatry, we cannot really attain to the individuality that we can otherwise attain to, and we cannot then live together as we otherwise could live together, and we remain groveling in the dirt, unfortunately. And consequently, it's a task and a half for anybody in such a society to become what they can be and to realize their uniquely human potentialities, but it can still be done. Right? Insofar as, again, the question is not an uncontacted tribe, and there's access to the works of the past and such. And yet, that kind of can point towards an ideal, a societal ideal that we can aim for, and that is predicated precisely on the firm faith that there is something over and above me objectively, and that I cannot stop with myself, that I cannot feed upon myself and live by my own desires and by my own law. Without that faith, right, without that mental fixture, each person is reduced to his or her own animality and corporality, and must necessarily live in an ultimately zero-sum game. And that does not make for society, or at least a human society and a human civilization, and a human civilization and society does not make for human individuals, and going then in the wrong direction. So some considerations.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you for that. God bless. Excellent.